What's going on, everyone? Just to do some quick introductions here. I'm Torrin Shirk, the Marketing Media Manager at Servicide. If you're not a Servicide member, what this is our monthly webinar. We do 1 to 2 of these a month on various topics, hunting tactics to help you be more successful in the woods. So the way that this is going to work is you're going to drop your questions for Jared in the chat section. If you're on a mobile device, you can find that in the more where it's the ... Just type in your question there. I'm going to moderate it to Jared and he's going to get to them as I filter them to him. If anybody has any questions on anything else as far as the format of how this is going to go, just drop them in the chat. If you're having any issues, try to drop them in the chat there. You can also raise your hand if you're having trouble, and I can turn on your audio and then you can ask your question directly. There's a Q&A button at the top there. You can drop them there as well and I'll get to them. So let me just double check the chat here and make sure that we're not having any issues. David, looks like you're good, correct? It looks like you're good. All right. So again, welcome everyone to the Spot and Stalk webinar hosted by Servicide. Like I said, I'm Torrin Shirk, the Marketing Media Manager. Jared Scheffler, owner of Whitetail Adrenaline, is going to be our special guest. So Jared, I'm going to hop off here. If you want to introduce yourself, let them know a little bit about you and about the company. That'd be great.
Give me 1 second here to get this thing pulled up here. Okay. All right. Good to go. Hopefully everyone can hear me here. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jared Scheffler from Whitetail Adrenaline. For those that don't know a little bit about my background, the company's background, it was started in 2007. Just a couple of us, mainly my cousin and I, we produced a video that was completely sponsored. What's that?
No, sorry, go ahead.
Okay. All right. We produced our first video in 2007 and just had a lot of fun with it. Didn't follow necessarily any guidelines of what you should necessarily be doing while out there hunting. It was pretty aggressive, quite a bit of on the ground stuff. And the following year, we kicked off the All Public Land series, which is what we've ran for 13 years or something like that since. And throughout that time, we've learned a lot of different things along the way, made a lot of different mistakes along the way, all of which are in the video. Fortunately for either your laughter or potentially gaining some knowledge of what not to do, and also some things that have worked very well. And we've gotten fairly oiled in some ways with it. So that's a little bit about, a brief version of, I guess, how long I've been doing this in the video space and what our videos are kind of about. So.
And all your stuff is public land too.
Correct. So our first one, we did a by permission, some public, some knock on door permission, much like anybody else could knock on doors. And just had a lot of fun with it. The following year, 2008, is when we kicked off the All Public Land series. So we learned quite a bit along the way. We were more strapping young bucks back then. So our videos have always been not so much like a formal how-to. We were in our young 20s. Who are we to talk about, what somebody should or shouldn't be doing or whatever. And what we found in hunting is you can about break every rule and be successful, and you can follow every one and not be successful. So every situation is different and calls for different tactics, techniques, and things like that. So our videos have never really been so much of the how-to side, just entertainment, what happens along the way, and all filmed on the fly just as is. So
All right, excellent, excellent. So I think for starting off, why don't we discuss the topic of how you guys go about, or how you specifically, Jared, go about finding mature animals to hunt?
Sure, sure. I mean, the number one thing is covering ground. From what I've learned over the years, a lot of public land just isn't worth your time. Rather than try to spend so much time, you go back 10, 15, 20 years ago, it was more like zone in and learn every little detail about this piece of public. And, and I went through that whole stage too. I grew up near a big giant public land swamp and did real well overall in that swamp. It wasn't a great area known for a lot of big bucks and whatnot. I learned a lot of things, but what I found over the course of time is I'm a lot better suited to have a very aggressive style that allows me to, without a lot of investment, try to cover a lot of acreage, because a lot of public land is either too pressured or been getting too pressured, and finding big mature quality animals on those public lands is they're a lot fewer and far between. So that's the number one thing I learned. And I really started to see that come to life a few years into the videos. The first few videos, we shot a number of deer off the ground. I'd been hunting off the ground on and off ever since really I started hunting, but I played the 10-pound tree stand game, go in, try to program, pattern them, try to predict what they're going to do. I just eventually I was enjoying hunting on the ground so much, but after a few seasons of doing it, and we were trying to get all of our content captured with just one camera. I mean, we've never had any sponsors. We didn't have a big budget to work with. We were more weekend warriors going out there and didn't have a lot of time. And then in the spring, I had to work a regular job, plus edit the videos, plus get out on the road to the shows. I didn't have time to pre-scout, spring scout, summer scout, do all that thing. And so I just really just had to find a way that allowed me to still go into the fall and in a very quick time be able to get on good quality animals that, on public land, or if I'm going to a new state or a new area or an area I haven't been to for a year, I needed to have a system that would work for me. And it just kind of, after a number of seasons, it just became very clear, covering ground and making really good educated decisions before investing a bunch of time in a specific spot, I was getting a lot further ahead, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Can you talk about how you go about deciding whether a piece is worth your time hunting? I think that was one of the things that came up on the podcast that the audience was a little bit confused about.
Sure. So it doesn't really matter if I'm hunting wooded stuff of Wisconsin like I used to a lot more, or open prairie country, or broken country like some of Iowa stuff is, a mixture of woods and gnarly brush mixed with CRP grass. A lot of our more recent videos have been a little bit more of the open, or quite a bit more of the open plains country, where we're more or less getting a visual. But at the same point, I hunt a number of states where you got draws and brush pocket, brush draws and timber, and I have in the past. It doesn't matter if I'm hunting open country or closed country. I'm going to spend that first day or two when I get to an area just driving by a lot of different public, just trying to narrow it down as to like what pieces are really getting targeted. And it's pretty easy to tell, especially on a weekend, just looking at vehicles in parking lots along the roads, or if it's not a weekend, looking at the, how much pressure it looks like the parking lot's been getting, and I might not be able to get visuals of, if it's more timber country, I'm not going to be able to necessarily get visuals, say, from the vehicle, but it's still, big mature deer don't like people. They don't like being around people. And so I'm going to spend that first day or two just trying to find either public pieces or pockets within that public that I suspect are not getting the pressure. And that's a big plus in my department. So if I spend a day or two doing that, I'm going to eliminate basically a lot of acreage. That's really what I'm trying to do. Is I don't go into it with the mentality of let me try to find the pocket as much as just eliminating the acreage, or I mean, it's probably about a wash. Of course, I'm trying to zone in on where I think one would be, but if you just focus on trying to minimize acreage, you'll end up, finding the little nooks and crannies a little bit quicker. I think that's what I've seen over the years. And like I said, if it's timber country, well, you've eliminated a lot of acreage by that 1 day drive you did buy a bunch of stuff. There's going to be quite a bit of acreage that you're going to be able to get a feel for right out of the gate. That's not worth your time. So, and obviously using boats and canoes and, if it's a swampy or you got to cross a creek or wade through a river and things like that. I mean, anything that takes tough access, generally speaking, in higher pressure states is also a good thing to consider. So.
Eric Delaney asked, once you get a visual on a target animal, what do you do if that animal's nocturnal?
Okay, all right. So he asked, what do I do if that animal's nocturnal?
Yeah.
Okay, I used to look at a deer like it's nocturnal. That was more back when I used to play the tree stand game, because my cards were left more for the deer, what that deer's going to do. Now with how we're approaching it, more spot and stock fashion, still hunting fashion, you don't really, I don't really look at the nocturnal aspect no longer, because I have the ability to potentially sneak in on this animal if all goes well, whether he's nocturnal or not. Now, if it's a deer that's nocturnal, as in it's on private ground, and I'm playing the public land side, that's a different scenario. In that scenario, if he's not getting on public till daylight, there's nothing I can really do except go invest my time trying to find a different piece of public or whatnot that's going to work a little bit better for me. And maybe I come back closer to rut, and maybe I've caught him where he's pushed a doe into a pocket onto the public or whatnot. But I don't really ever view a deer anymore. I remember, 15, 20 years ago, a lot more when I was playing the more pattern and try to predict what they're going to do and when they're going to do it and all that. I used to, the nocturnal thing used to be something that I considered, but I don't really consider that anymore. Because all I'm trying to do is get a visual, whether it's still hunting through the timber or open country, getting one and then executing a plan. They're not really nocturnal anymore if I've got a visual on them and they're bedded or they bed down. Because now I'm holding the cards in my pocket where I'm going to them. And that's one thing that I started to realize 15 years ago a lot more, is if I've got the visual on them right now, I've got a lot stronger likelihood to get myself in position, whether it's to put together a game plan to cut him off where I think he's headed, or sneak in on him right now if he's bedding or killing time and I got enough time and the conditions are right for me to do that. I have a lot higher likelihood, is what I noticed, of getting on that animal and making it happen right now versus, okay, I'm going to hope he does that tomorrow night and I'm going to slip in there, with my tree stand real light and quiet and, make sure the wind's right and all that, and then try to hope he does the same thing again. I found the results usually were better going in right away. So not always, but it's hunting. Justin
Edwards asked, what maps do you use to find those hidden pockets? And I know this is going to be a good one because we covered a little bit of this on the podcast.
Yeah. So basically some of the states have come up with pretty good mapping systems that show where the public land is, and then also have satellite aerial topo map over the top. I like to use the state's DNR maps. A few years back, I kind of learned a little lesson, a little bit more the hard way. So if they've got one, I use theirs. If they don't have a good one, then I use like Onyx. I think there's another one, Base Maps. A couple of my guys have been using that lately, and they really like that as well. I think it's called Base Maps. But either way, it's really nice to have, especially when you're covering ground like this. I mean, this used to be a lot more foreign to a lot of hunters, but I'm so used to it now where it's like I roll into an area I've never been to before, and I'm going to drive by all this different public. And it's really nice to have a map at that point with aerials and topos that show me right where the property lines are. So it, you know, because you've never been there, you've never walked this stuff, you've never pre-scouted it. And sometimes you get a visual and you've got a half hour of light left and you've never been on this piece of public before, and you need to make a move right now and know where you can and can't be. So I first start and look at the state. Some states offer a good solution. And since I have Onyx anyways, I also, if I have any questions, I'll cross compare. And just keep in mind the way the state's laws are written, if something's even wrong at the state's maps level, you're ultimately at fault. So let's say they had the map wrong. Ultimately, you're at fault. That's the way the law is written. You're supposed to know even if their map's wrong. So I went down that road. But nonetheless, it's a really good resource to have, is an aerial topo with the public private lines on it. And, you know, I mean, it's necessary to have. Now, as far as how do I use that before my hunt starts? I really don't, other than if I'm going to an area or I think I'm going to start out in an area, I might, or I'm not sure what part of the state I want to start out in. I might pull up, say, let's just use Onyx, for example, or whatever mapping solution I'm using. I'm going to pull it up and get an idea of like, okay, is there very much public in this area? Sometimes there might not be a lot, and that might be a little hidden gem that a lot of other people aren't going to travel out of their way for, because there's not a whole saturation, you know, a whole area saturated with a lot of public lands. Either way, if my hunt hasn't started, let's say I'm going to do this, I'm just going to pull up that map and like briefly look and see, okay, yeah, there's some public in this area. And I might zoom in on a few pieces just for a minute or two. Okay, yeah, that might be worth my time, you know, And I don't put any more effort into it than that, any more investment into it than that. What I've found is many times the stuff that looks good on aerial is also being targeted by a lot of other people that saw that map as public land pressures. You know, I mean, 15 years ago when I started doing the public land thing, you know, the whole mentality on public land shifted. It was like, oh, all I have to hunt is public land. Now it's more shifted into more of like I want to hunt public. It's a very much more positive, and you get people that actually really enjoy hunting public land and the challenges and everything that come with that. So we're seeing the pressure levels of public land rising, and obviously with the maps availability and all of that stuff that really sticks out as looking good, a lot of times is drawn in a lot of other hunters. I may look at like, okay, there's a river here and I doubt and it's this piece of public's landlocked, but I can use this river to get to it. I might use it like that to survey, like, okay, maybe guys aren't using crossing this river or using a boat or using a canoe or whatnot. But I'm generally not looking for the stuff that jumps out at me. And I'm generally not spending a bunch of time investing into try to visualize how everything's going to be. Because once I get there on site in the area, everything I thought and imagined in my head can be totally different. Pressure levels and all kinds of different variables. So I don't like to get, I call that going down a rabbit hole a lot more so. And it's not that it's a bad thing. It's just the further down that hole you go, if you get there and things are not in accordance to what you visualized or maybe thought, it's harder to get you to pull out of that rabbit hole. So I do call it kind of a rabbit hole. Very few people can actually invest a lot of time like that and scrap it in an instant. Usually it's like they kind of begin to try to force it and, mold it and make it work for themselves, if that kind of makes sense. So that's a little bit how I've literally went on hunts before. I drew a tag a few years ago And I didn't have time to even look. I went off my cousin's. He's like, yeah, I know. I heard this area might be pretty good, this unit. So I put in for it. I didn't even know what part of the state. I just trusted his judgment on it until I was like driving to that state. Like I didn't even look up what part of the state or anything. Like that's how ill prepared. I felt good about it. Like I didn't feel like I was under gun because I'm coming in there with a very clear, like I'm not emotionally attached to anything I saw on aerials. Once I get there, I'm going to be able to survey where all the pressure levels are. I'm going to have the mapping system that shows me right where the public is. You know, you can put things together pretty quick in that fashion. So,
Jared, question. So Luke Linsmeyer is curious as to what terrain features do you look for to help eliminate wasted space to save you time when you're trying to cut down a chunk of public?
okay. Can you just kind of say that once more? Just, I want to make sure I get this right.
Sure. So Luke Linsmeyer would like to know what specific terrain features you look for to eliminate, to cut down wasted space to save you time when chunking down a piece of public.
Sure. I mean, obviously anything that I can visually see and see that there's not, you know, let's just say I'm looking for a big buck. Anything I can visually glass pretty well, you know, I'm eliminating that acreage. Obviously we already talked about pressure. If I feel, you know, this part of this public is getting pressured or the whole thing's getting pressured, I don't dedicate much time to it. There's more public land out there. Even if I got to drive a half hour to get to a new area, if it's getting pressured, I'm scrapping. I'm pulling the plug. It doesn't matter if I got to go check out of the motel or rip the tent down or whatever it is. If it's getting too pressured, I'm out. I'm getting out of there, and I'm going to go invest my time trying to find something that's not. So as far as terrain features go like that, I mean, other than being able to see it visually, to see, like in the plains of Kansas where I hunt and the grass is this short, I can look out there and do a quick scan with the binoculars and pretty well get it covered to know, okay, there's nothing laying out in that 160 acres that I can see. I mean, there still could be a little tiny ditch or something in there that I can't see from aerial or see, you know, from long distance that one could be in, or a little tiny divot in a hole, but I don't know for sure. You're just doing the best you can. You know, any more than that, I mean, I can't really, you know, say that terrain necessarily. Beyond that, I can't really say that there's any specific terrain that I would use to eliminate it. It's more based on like pressures and whether I see them or not. If it looks like a piece that's going to be very difficult, like, or a part of it that's just too much of a, what I'd call a jungle or whatever, I might find like more of the fringes, you know, like let's just say it's a massive jungle, you know, something like that. I'm probably going to steer clear of that, because if it's what I'm talking about, it's going to be very difficult to still hunt through it and get a beat on them first and all of that without them spotting you first. So, you know, you're going off your gut. Unfortunately, in this type of hunting, many times you're going off of your gut, which we talk about the gut, not to get too sidetracked. I believe the gut is really more from coming from your subconscious and unconscious's mind of what it's stored over the years of all the experiences that you've gathered. And I think that's what really is the gut feeling. So the more experience, the more you get out there and do it, you're going to get a sharper gut feeling, if you will, of whether you should pull the plug or not. Generally, if you feel that you should do that, you should. So generally speaking.
We had a couple questions roll through asking about hunting large chunks of timber and swamp conditions, that kind of habitat and terrain. So do you want to kind of talk about, Jared, how you go through piecing together, let's say you're hunting the northern woods of Wisconsin or upper Michigan, something where you're going to run into large tracts of timber or swamp?
Sure. Well, I haven't, to be fair, I haven't hunted a lot of northern Wisconsin or any northern Michigan for that matter. I did grow up hunting a very large public land swamp, tag elders, cattails, all that kind of stuff. And we, even in my younger days, we shot a number of bucks out there and some pretty decent ones. It's a little different game. I haven't done as much of the swamp stuff in recent years because I just love hunting deer on the ground so much that, how I used to do it back then is I'd climb up tamaracks and things like that out there, and where you could see over everything. And that's the only way that I could really get visuals. And I grew up in a shotgun country too. So whether I was bow or gun, I'd still have to get pretty close. And then maybe I'd shimmy down and get a little bit closer and climb another one or whatever. Let's say you're going to hunt a big woods area like what you're describing. The deer density levels are probably pretty low. So I'm actually going to go in pretty aggressively. And generally I'm pretty aggressive already, but especially when you have low deer numbers like that, if you just go like a tortoise, you're going to not cover a lot of ground, and you really need to put some boots on the ground and cover ground. And that's where you're going to have to rely on more of the deer sign that you find, where you're going to have to, start finding those big rubs and scrapes and, some big tracks and things of that nature. And then once you start seeing stuff like that, then put the brakes on and start to take it all in. And maybe you can pull up your aerials and your topos at that point and kind of look at how, and try to visualize where this deer might be coming and going, and put some things together and really put the brakes on. Maybe you want to start still hunting it. But at that point, that's where you're going to really put the brakes on. Outside of that, I'd be walking through a lot of that country until I find the sign. Ultimately, I'm generally, even on timber deer, I'm looking for a visual. But in the big wood stuff of where we're talking, if those deer density numbers are low, or if your objective is to find a big buck and the numbers of big bucks in those areas are low, you still need to cover a lot of ground, almost more so than in an area that you don't have, or that you have more mature bucks, say per every 10 square miles or whatnot. Because you got to cover more ground until you find that sign. Now in the timber stuff of, let's say you got a higher density of big bucks in an area, but you're still hunting timber, and you're probably going to be seeing some decent big buck sign quite regularly all throughout the timber, or at different stages of that. You might not have to put on 5 or 10 miles on the boots before you find that. You might find that half mile or whatever of mile of trouncing around. At that point, if I don't know anything about that area or pocket, I'm probably, once I start finding that sign, it's earned a little bit more respect of my time. So maybe I need to put the brakes on a little bit. And now I'm going more into still hunt slow mode, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. We'll see if he follows up with another question. So this,
I want to make one more point on that. We have killed a number of bucks doing this. At first it was an accident, and this is in timber applications. If it's like the rut peak lockdown, we killed a couple, I think it was 2 or 3 big bucks doing this by accident, not trying to be sneaky or anything. We just happened to be walking through and jumped a big buck on a doe, and we gave them half hour, 45 minutes to forget about us, and pressed on in the direction they disappeared. If it's big timber, they generally don't go very far, and that buck has them. Basically I know that if it's timber and you jump a big buck on a doe, that's hot, they're not hardly ever going more than 400 yards in the direction of where you last seen them. So I give them a half hour, 45 minutes to calm down. That buck gets her all, stopped and everything. They forget about us, and we press in there. Now I know a little sliver right up ahead that there's a big buck almost always within. So now we started, after we did it 3 times by accident, we started implementing that as a technique. And I've told that technique a little bit to a handful of other guys that have tried it, and it's worked. So it sounds radical and silly, but that's the thing. Anybody that's watched our videos knows we're always trying out there in left field. I mean, I got laughed at by a lot, especially in my early days, but about a lot of our tactics and things we were doing, but they're beginning to become more and more used by a lot of other hunters, because they're beginning to see that, hey, sometimes that's the best option, or silly stuff happens out there. Why not try? So.
Yeah, no, that one's great. And that's something I'm going to implement this year too. Question from Eric is, have you historically had greater success with spot and stalk or ambush? So I want to kind of piggyback on this. I think some
Sure.
people may get confused as to your quote unquote spot and stalk tactics.
Yep.
I feel like, Jared, you probably use both quite a bit. It's not strictly spot and stalk. If the situation calls for one, you do the one. If the situation calls for the other, you do the other. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes. So exactly. So sometimes there's situations where maybe a spot and stalk isn't the right move. And I'll give you a few examples. I had a big buck 2 years ago. It was the smartest deer I've ever seen. Just everything about him. I got to play games with him for a week. I found him back 6 out of the 7 days, bedded. I watched how he would shift his right where he was bedded within a half hour of the wind switch, and he'd shift over here 30, 40 yards to accommodate that. And how he was doing it was just, even studying him at a mile when he'd get on his feet, and how he was so just edgy, on point about every little detail, making sure other smaller bucks that were with him had different areas covered so nothing could sneak in on him. I mean, he was just really a sharp deer. Finally, I had a situation where, I could have pretty much gotten a compound range pretty much every time on this deer, but I'm trying to go in tight with a longbow. I finally got a situation where just, if we played our cards just right, we could slip in there and I could get to like 30 yards, but just the way this deer was, I just didn't feel good about getting any closer. And between the wind and everything like that, and how he had all the currents, I mean, I could barely make this work. And so we got in that tight, and then we played ambush. Like, this is what I think he's going to do after he gets on his feet. And it worked out perfect, other than I blew the shot. So that's a situation right there that I kind of read the situation, the deer, and I wasn't able to go move right in and, execute it right there where he was bedding. But I was able to get to 30 yards, 30, 35 yards right in there on him. And then I set up for ambush. There's other situations. I had a piece in timber here in Wisconsin a number of years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, something like that, where we'd go in, and a lot of other guys were hunting this piece of timber, but they were missing this little tiny corner. The deer sign was there, and these deer were coming off a private, hitting the public for 150 yards and looping right back onto private. So there's not much I can do there. I can't go in and really still hunt that or stalk that. I mean, it was fairly open right there. I mean, you pretty much had it covered the second you got in there. So that was more of a situation where I'm going to go in now and I'm going to set up more like ambush. Now, most of the deer that I've killed have been spot and stalk. Like, I'm moving in tight enough to where either they're getting shot in their bed or waiting for them to get up. And I would say that that's how most of the guys in our crew get most of their deer, is in that fashion. Here and there, they'll go in on a spot that they feel very confident about, and they don't know for sure what might come through or whatnot. But most of the time, we're really trying to get visuals and move in to either execute the situation, the shot right there, or get as tight as we possibly can and still make that wind work, and then try to predict what they're going to do that last, maybe it's 50 yards, maybe it's 100 yards. I had a deer in late season, really big giant, along with 12 other bucks that were batch grouped up. I was, the closest I could possibly get was a half a mile from where he was bedded, because him or one of the bucks would have me any other way. And he was on private in that case, and I was waiting for him to come, but he wasn't very far from the line. But literally, I mean, that's as close as I could get. Sometimes it's 30 yards, sometimes it's a half mile, so maybe that doesn't answer exactly, or maybe I missed a couple of things there.
No. I think you hit it. I mean, it's very situational, and it depends on what you're doing. Your style, and would you say, Jared, that like you're a little bit more aggressive where you may not use an ambush tactic and you'll go ahead and push the spot and stalk because of how you're hunting, where you got a cameraman, you're on a time budget, that kind of stuff too plays a little bit of a role?
Yeah. I'd say, I'd say more in the early days. Actually, I made a comment recently to one of the guys that's out in the field. We've gotten to the point, we used to be a lot more weekend warriors where you only got 3-5 days on an out-of-state hunt. You got to make it happen. And now sometimes myself or the other guys, they could have 2 weeks, and I kind of said something recently to one of the guys that was on a hunt. And I said, hunt like you got 5 days, not 20. meaning because I've seen my own self do this where, okay, the conditions aren't quite right. I could get a wind swirl here, It's early season. I can kind of play this game maybe a little bit for a few days, and sometimes that's the right decision to do. But many times I've also looked back on it and been like, I should have just gotten aggressive. Like today was my last day, I will take aggressive hunting over passive hunting when it comes to public land all day long. And now that's between the two, but having a good balance of passive aggressive is even better than that. So I'll give you an example. Like when Chancey started hunting with us 5-6 years ago, Chancey's a really just wired, just 100-mile-an-hour kind of guy. He came in with a lot of aggressiveness up front, and he actually, most hunters do not come in that way. They usually come in more passive from what I've observed. He came in too aggressive, and he naturally just kind of within a season or two realized like, I need to really kind of like pick my times here and dial it back. And now he's got a phenomenal balance of passive aggressive, if that kind of makes sense, of knowing like, okay, I need to cover ground. I need to get here. This deer can't see me. He can't hear me. He can't smell me. I need to cover this ground. And up here, I'm going to have to really put on the brakes to be able to slip in there without him seeing or hearing me. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. We had a question come up. Do you consider barometric pressure, moon phase, whether all those aspects into deer movement with your style of hunting?
I really haven't watched it that close. I do believe that there's a lot to do with that triggers different deer movements and different things. Some of it may be more regional or different drier areas versus more humid areas. I do think that there's a number of factors in there. The reason I haven't really paid that much attention to it is because I couldn't, back in the older days, I had my hunt planned for certain dates or weekend either way. I was going to hunt. If it was the weekend, I was going to hunt either way. And I didn't really plan things, you know what I mean? So I just really didn't, I was like, well, I'm hunting either way. And I didn't really like keep track. I kind of wish I would have actually, because more in recent years, I've noticed some different things that I've looked back on throughout my hunting lifetime of situations and things. It's for instance, many times I've seen a cold front actually do the opposite of what I grew up thinking it does. And then there's also some different discoveries with that can counter that. There's definitely something to like a light cold snap in the earlier October months, whereas in some of these states, whether it's September or October, more of the dry, not so humid. And I don't know if that's the reason why I'm starting to pay attention more to it, but I've noticed cold fronts, like, I don't want nothing to do with them. I don't want extreme heat, either. I prefer just like average temps for that time of the year. And if there is a cold front, I just a little bit, same with a warm, I just, like a little bit. Now, if there's a cold front moving in, what I'm always looking for, and it seems to be failing, and I haven't hunted every state or every region, but I've been really paying attention to it for the last 4 or 5 years, is the day that the warmth comes in and the sun pops out after that cold front. That's always better that I've seen than the incoming cold front. So I am paying more attention to that stuff, and I've griped about it on some of the more recent videos. But there's a lot of truth to what I've seen out there with it. So I can't speak throughout the country everywhere. It's like I recently had a discussion with Kevin Vistison where he brought up, like, in Michigan, getting that little bit of colder weather drops certain types of leaves and acorns and things like that. And I think there's a lot of truth to that in the more wooded stuff in different areas, why you may see more activity in certain cases. There's a lot of variables there, but I don't really pay attention too much to it. The other thing I've noticed is if the wind's blowing, at sunlight, like as it's getting daylight, if the wind's already blowing like 15 miles an hour and has been for an hour before or whatever, I might as well just almost sleep in. I don't, but I always just kind of know going into it, I'm not going to see near the deer numbers. But then I also know that an hour and a half, 2 hours into the day, those deer are going to start popping and getting on their feet and stretching and repositioning and doing different things. So, and I've caught on to that pretty well. And I truthfully, I think that the reason they're bedded down, they're already bedded down most of the time if there's a 15 mile an hour or better wind, and I can't say it's exactly 15 mile an hour right on the head, and obviously certain terrains, if they're out of the wind and there's a big long draw system, they could be moving through there and it could be not 50, could not be very windy in there. I'm just saying in general, there's definitely some truth to that. And I think the reason they're bedded down is because deer really can't see that great from what I've noticed in many, many years. They can't really see that great at night without like a full moon or a decent moon. And when you get 15 mile an hour or better winds approximately around there, they lose a lot of their hearing ability. They already can't see very good. And in some cases, it really jacks the winds and different terrains, and things can start doing things where they can't really tell where maybe they're smelling whatever's coming at them exactly, like where the danger is. And I think it just freaks them out, and they just rather at least have their eyes. And that's why I generally see, I think, better activity sometime in morning after the sun's up on windier days, and I don't know, it's just a theory at this point, but I guess I kind of ended abruptly there, but and that's maybe a little bit of a long-winded discussion on barometric. I haven't really studied barometric pressure, so I haven't really paid much attention to that. I do believe that there's definitely something there as well. So. Hello? Okay. Not sure what's going on here. Technical.
Sorry. I was
okay. I'm not sure if anybody can. I didn't know if it was on my end or your end or what.
No. I thought I had the mute off and I didn't.
Got ya.
Yeah. So to get back to barometric pressure, there is a correlation to deer movement, but it's a lot more finite based on the studies that I've read when I was a biologist. It's very confusing stuff. But anyway, Jacob Askins wants to talk about gear a little bit.
Okay.
And his question is, when planning to cover a lot of ground, what do you look for in boot selection? Is there a difference in your selection when hunting bottomlands versus mountain terrain? And then do you look, which I would assume you do, look for gear that is specifically suited to spot and stalk hunting?
Yeah. I'm going to, if you give me 5, maybe 10 seconds, I'm going to go quick grab. I meant to grab them, what I use on my feet. Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead. So I hope everyone's enjoying the webinar so far. Keep those questions coming. Either drop them in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll get to them. We're pushing an hour here, and then 8:30, we're going to cut it off. I want to respect Jared's time, so get in your questions while you can.
Okay, so as far as shoes, these are the all-time, my favorites right here. This is my 4th or 5th pair. They're pretty shot, as you can see. This is a Gore-Tex version. Either way, I don't really, Gore-Tex is maybe a little bit nicer, but we all know how that doesn't always work. But they're very thin, very light. This is a new pair that I just got here last week. What I like is they're around 12 ounces for the pair, which I have big feet. These are 12 and a halves. And big feet, I hate heavy boots. I hate heavy on my foot. It's a lot when you're covering ground. It's just, yeah, I mean, hold a half pound out here with your arm for a while. I mean, I don't like putting a lot of weight on my feet. And also with these, they're pretty thin soled, so I can feel really good. They got great, these ones don't have great traction anymore, but they're pretty flat down there, but they got pretty aggressive tread. If I need to run in them, cut a deer off, get ahead, they're light, zippy, quick. They're actually like mountain trail running shoes. Also, I just want to reiterate, I don't do any sponsors, and I pay 100%. I just found these on Amazon somewhere for, I don't know what they are, 130, 150 bucks, something like that. But I love them. There's a couple other ones that are light as well. I can't remember the brands off the top of my head. There's a new one that I discovered after I bought this pair that seems pretty legit too. So you might want to just try a few different pairs out. I have hunting boots. I pretty much have abandoned those for a number of years, just because they're so heavy. And I just found this pair. It again happens to be a Solomon. I think these cost me 150 bucks. Very aggressive tread. This is a high topper. It is not a Gore-Tex, but the material is so thin on it that it dries out pretty quick. And my feet also sweat pretty good. So even in late season last year in December, with pretty cold temperatures, like 10 degrees and a couple inches of snow, I was still wearing this shoe with a short gaiter, and I'd put on like a big thick wool sock, like a darn tough wool or whichever thick wool sock. And I actually really loved it. Going up and down different hills and draws and systems, I was like, I don't need any more than this, because I think my feet stayed just as warm because they weren't sweating so much as they do once I start putting on a heavy boot. I just don't carry all that extra weight around with me. The reason I decided to try these, because I seen them and they reminded me of these low top. They're very, very light. This is probably the lightest high top that I've found. It's called a Solomon Assault. It's a newer boot, I believe, because I haven't seen it before. It's not that much heavier. It's about 22 ounces. I think that's for the pair. So I think these are 12, within an ounce of 12, these are 22. That's really light for a high topper. And I got these more for mountain or a little bit deeper snow. These, unfortunately, like I said, are not Gore-Tex or waterproof or anything, but that's what I like to use on my feet. You asked one other, there was a little bit deeper than just footwear, I think you had said.
One of the other questions were, have you ever used stalking socks? And
I tell you what, yeah. On the thing of socks, I'll hit that and then maybe prep me on the other one. This was probably 8 years ago. I've done pretty well in just wearing tennies. I've been wearing tennies for many, many years. I mean, even before the videos, I had just pulled a transmission out of a truck. My shoes, my tennies, I had Merrells, were all covered in tranny fluid. And this thing, I dropped it myself and it fell on my chest and cut my arm or something. I was upset. So I went hunting for the last half hour of light in that whole get up and, headed off a big buck and shot him. And so I've been running tennies a long time, but I also kind of ran boots within there. But pretty much the last number of years, I got away from them. But as far as taking my shoes off to stock in my socks, I only tried that once, and that was about 8 years ago. And it was, I had a big buck spotted, and I felt like I needed to be quiet. And somebody had just told me, that they had killed one, taking their shoes off and socks. And I never should have done it. I should have just kept my shoes on. Not to say that it was bad, just maybe a bad situation for it, because there was just enough currents and things in there that when I pulled off my shoe, you're releasing a massive amount of scent all of a sudden. And unfortunately, one of those little currents got to him. And I do think that I probably would have gotten that deer had I not done that. So I haven't taken mine off since. Not to say that it's a bad thing. It's just be smart about it. Maybe pick your, it's kind of like a grunt tube or a deer call or anything like that. Certain situations may call for it, and then other certain situations. And part of the deal is that me taking the time to take that shoe off also cost me 30 seconds to a minute of me being a lot closer to that deer in a situation. He ended up standing and I would have had a shot, but he was standing because he caught that odor, but I wasn't even close enough quite yet to be able to execute the shot with my longbow. So I was kind of screwed in two departments because of that. Time that it cost me, and then the reason I believe he got on his feet is because he got just a little bit of that odor, because it was like when you pull your shoe off, you get a spurt of boom, I'm here.
That makes a lot of sense. Like I never would have considered that. What about if you would have taken it off a little bit farther away? Would the situation still have occurred that way?
Sure. You know, I'm a firm believer that, and I've seen this many times, and I believe this to be true, I have gotten away with it quite a bit more as far as a deer being able to smell me. If I've just been out in higher winds for half the day, because my clothes and everything have just gotten so blown out that there's not much scent left there. If I would have taken them off a half hour before, maybe it wouldn't have played too big of a factor. I don't know on that. You know, I mean, like I said, every situation's different. I just, after looking back on it, I was like, there was no need. I could have at least gotten to bow range before I even attempted to do that. That was stupid of me. I should have at least gotten to bow range, because when he stood, I could have taken a shot. It was grass, and with how I shoot a longbow, I could have horizontally sent the arrow where he wouldn't have probably flushed. I wouldn't have had to get upright like you do with a compound, and I probably could have gotten that deer. So it's just a bad call on my decision, which I've made many small little mistakes and learned a lot of things over the years. So still more to learn.
What about your pants and jacket and stuff like that? Do you prefer wool over synthetic or vice versa? What about that stuff?
Okay. All right. So I hunted in just all kinds of regular stuff for many, many years. Then I started doing some elk hunting probably 5-6 years ago. And I was like, you know, I haven't even really spent any money on hunting clothes or anything like that in probably 10 years since I was, I don't know, really young. So I was like, I invested quite a bit in some merino wools and things like that. And they're nice. Are they necessary? Absolutely not. They're not necessary, but if you have the money for them, sure, go for it. You know, I mean, my boy Tanner there, he's killed 4 elk and four times trying, and he hasn't been with anybody that, I mean, he's learned it all himself, and he's killed 4 bulls, and he wears cotton socks. He doesn't even know what the heck merino wool is. So, I mean, it's not slowing him down any, and he doesn't know any better. So I don't hear, when it comes to gear and stuff like that, there's certain things that I don't like to get too carried away or too caught up in, as far as like, one, I need really good optics because I'm relying a lot on visuals. So optics are very key. If I forget my binoculars and I'm like, I leave the vehicle and I forget my binoculars, whether I'm hunting timber or open country or whatever, I feel so screwed and so lost without them. It happens every once in a while, and I'm just like, oh my God, because I rely on them so much. So that's a must for me. As far as camouflages go, I really don't care, long as it's not dark, usually, like anything dark. I really don't care. I just killed a big buck, actually, in this right here a few weeks ago. just a, I don't know, a $30 shirt, real light. It was nice. It was 93 degrees out, and beach shorts I bought in Fort Lauderdale, like, and I got up 4.5 yards on them, I got asked this a number of years ago, like about camouflages. And I said, well, I haven't found a camouflage yet where if they're looking towards my direction, I feel comfortable moving. But if they're not looking, I feel like I can about wear anything. And that, I think there's a lot of truth to that. So I don't like to, if you think your camouflage is going to save you, it's probably not. The only time that I think makes a big difference is once they have broken around 20, 25 yards, even without your movement, they can pick you up. So that's where I think camouflage can kind of start to come into play a lot more. But is it going to be the deal breaker? Is it going to make you way more successful? No, it's not in reality of it. So when you're spotting and stalking and moving in on an animal, the number one thing is you just do not move if they're looking anywhere your direction. I mean, you can get away with it from further distances and things like that. You find what you can and can't get away with. But as far as whether I'm wearing camo or not, it doesn't really make my decision on whether I'm going to move at that exact instance. It factors nothing into play there. So that's why I've never really gotten too caught up in it or worried about it. How a deer a lot of times identifies whether you're a human at all or not. And this is one thing I love about shooting longbow. One of the aspects that I really loved about it, they identify you as a human most of the time by right here, this outline, your head and shoulders. So with like a longbow, there's many times I've been down like on my knees like this, and I shoot the bow horizontal, and that buys me just a few seconds. They're like, what the heck is that? But if my head was like this, it's over. Big mature deer is like, yep, that's a human. I'm out of here. So, which, but yeah, that, I just don't like to get too caught up into the gear side of it. Like I like really light footwear. I like that. Optics, very important to me. Obviously your bow and arrows and things like that. I'm pretty particular on that aspect. The few handful of things that I view as necessities, I'm very particular on. But a lot of the other stuff, I mean, I'm not out there with much when I go hunting. It's usually my binocs, my bow and arrows, and most of the time that's it. If it's rut, I might have a grunt tube with me. I might have rattling antlers with me. I might have that decoy that we built with me, but it's not a whole, I don't have a backpack full of all kinds of gadgets and things like that. So not that you shouldn't, I just have found that many times I can get sidetracked with those things and thinking that they're going to make a big difference. And it starts to, there's other factors that I think are more important. So.
Questions rolling in here.
Okay.
And then I want to transition over to a couple different topics that we haven't covered yet, because I think they're extremely important. What do you do, or what do you do in a scenario where you're mostly finding just does, whether that's early season, mid season, or during the rut?
Okay. So I'm going to talk about Wisconsin on this one, because Wisconsin's like my home state. And we employed a tactic back more when we were weekend warriors, back around the 2010 era. In early October, we did a few bow drives. Early October, late September, early October, we did a few bow drives on pieces of public that we either hadn't hunted or hadn't been on and hunted since the year before. And the first one we ever did, we almost killed a really big deer, a really big deer, young deer, but big. Didn't get him. We did a couple other bow drives that season, or that October, over the next couple of weeks on different pieces. And the way I went about it was like, cool, we might get one, probably not, but let's just find out what's here. We were more like using it as taking inventory, and was able to identify some different pockets that it's like, I'm going to come back here closer to rut, like late pre-rut. And that's what we did with that big one that we almost got on that bow drive. Is we came back like the last couple of days of October and should have really gotten that deer. I should have gotten him one day. The next day we went in there and my buddy was up to bat. I was running the camera the second day. We didn't have him. We didn't get a visual. The day before we set up more of in an ambush point where we thought maybe we could catch him, kind of like what we talked earlier. The next day, that deer didn't come through anywhere in there. And rather than go back to the vehicle, I told Scott, I said, well, we don't have tree stands and all that we're ripping down and taking back to the truck. And that was our first year where we went completely on the ground and abandoned tree stands altogether. I said, let's start stalking and still hunting our way through this woods. Who knows? Maybe we'll spot him, maybe a different buck. Sure enough, it was like 2 hours later, we ended up spotting that big one. And he ended up falling into our lap in kind of an odd way. And we should have gotten that deer. Unfortunately, it's the only time I've ever been able to say this, but his bow was truly hitting like 8 to 10 inches, 10 inches high. Like I would have never guessed that, but anyways, not good. So we didn't get that deer. But to make a long story short, we evaluated that bow drive, that initial bow drive or going in aggressive like that, got us a beat on that deer. And then we also, on a few other pieces, observed that, okay, there's a half a dozen or eight does came out of here and they got jumped kind of in this pocket. This is a doe bedding area. We're going to start to focus in on those closer to the rut, like late pre-rut. We're going to be able to go in there and really work those little pockets. And we use that strategy for a number of years in Wisconsin. I haven't really hunted Wisconsin really hardly at all the last 4 or 5 years. So I haven't really used it there, but that was a great technique. I mean, it was a lot of wooded, a lot of Wisconsin is woods. We didn't know these pieces, what's on them, things like that. We didn't go in weekend after weekend doing bow drives, but just one, maybe two at most. Like on that big one, we tried to come back 10 days later to do that bow drive again. He wasn't in there, but that's it. Then we let it sit. But now we had kind of a beat on him, other pockets. We had a beat on does, and that works really, really well, especially when you're covering ground and you have a lot of different pieces of public. Just finding those doe bedding areas in like early October, if you've got all season and you're spring scouting and you're figuring out buck beds and doing all that kind of lingo, you probably don't want to do that because you've already got a beat on a lot of this stuff. But for us coming in where we haven't done all that, we don't know what's there. That's a great way for us to determine what is or isn't there, if that kind of makes sense. Okay, it's silent on this end.
Sorry, was answering some chats.
Gotcha.
Okay, so got that out of the way. Now I really want to dive into the wind because I think that's one of the things that people really either don't grasp or just don't understand.
Okay.
Especially when it comes to spot and stalk. And then also, Jared, include thermals into that as well in various different situations whether it's draws out in the prairie, creek bottoms, in the Midwest, or ridges.
Yep. The thing with thermals, I mean, it pretty much applies wherever, I guess I've noticed wherever you go is in the morning, as it warms up, your thermals are going to rise, which means your scent's going to rise up through the draws and the ditches and things like that. And in the evening, they're gonna sink. So, that applies. And so if I'm planning a stalk or an ambush or whatever, I do take that into account. If it's evening, I'm gonna consider like, okay, my scent's probably gonna start doing this the last half hour to hour of the hunt. And if he's not come through there yet, I got to know exactly where I got to take that shot before he hits that scent stream in an ambush type scenario. Now, let's say I've got a bead on a big one and I'm moving in on him or gonna move in on him. The first thing I actually do, if I got a big buck spotted and I got some time, like if it's rut and it's like, man, I got 10 minutes to get a half mile up here and get into position where I think this deer is going to come through. And I know the wind's coming right now out of the south. I'm just going to go with that information. If I got more time, like I've watched this deer bed, it's early season, or even if it's rut and he's got his doe hung up and they bed, I'm going to pull up whatever weather app you use and look and just see what the wind's going to do all day. When's it going to increase to its strongest level? What's it at now compared to what it's going to be throughout the day? As far as wind speed, because that's going to cover potentially more noise, and depending on where they're bedded and what the situation is, like if I got to crawl on my hands and knees, it's going to be a lot louder than me walking on my feet. And so, but if I walk on my feet, if they're in grass this tall, they're going to see me. But if they're buried in a pocket where I can be on my feet, well, I can get away with a lot more. I don't need as strong of a wind to cover my noise, if that kind of makes sense. So I'm looking at that, how much those winds are going to increase or decrease throughout the day. And also then wind direction. What's it saying that it's going to be? If it's northwest now, is it going to switch to southwest by the end of the day or in 5 hours? Because if I look at this stock, I mean, some stocks go really quick. Other stocks take hours. And if I predict that this stock's going to take me potentially 5-6 hours, or it's a situation where I got to get in there tight, but I can't quite get to where I can take a shot. So I'm going to have to get tight and then hope he does this, doing the ambush, spot and stock, then ambush. I'm going to want to know what that wind's going to do throughout the day, so I don't screw myself 4, 5, 6, 8 hours into the day. And all of a sudden now it switches in 180s. And now all I worked for and crawled in there is down the pipe because I didn't quickly look at what the wind's going to do direction wise. So that's the first thing that I do there if I have the time. From there, now let's say you've done all of that, and let's say it's not flat country. Let's say you got some ditches and draws and terrains and things like that. And let's say you got this big buck pinned down, or he's in this little 30 acre or 30 yard spot or a little pocket within here. And you're going to need to either sneak in there and then set up and hope he pops out on the side of the brush pocket or whatever he's in, or you got to, kind of like what we talked about. I'm going to sit back for a little bit, and, maybe it's 20 minutes, half hour, and I'm going to study all the grass and weeds kind of around that area and try to get an idea of what the wind currents are doing through there. You get to the point where you do that kind of stuff enough, and you can kind of just look at the terrain. That's one of them things that just comes with time. In that situation, the wind coming in, the prevailing wind of how it's blowing right then is coming in like this, and it's going to hit this and angle up like this. After you start to study that a lot more, you just kind of know it. You kind of look at, okay, this deer's bedded like this. We got this direction of wind. You got this hill here. You got this little divot here. You got this draw here, or whatever. And you just, your brain just calculates exactly. And it's usually pretty accurate, but not always. I mean, if I got the time, I'm going to study that because I need to know, if I get in there, especially when you're getting in tight, like longbow range, that's where things really start to get hairy as far as the currents. If you're going to hang out at 50, 60 yards and wait for him to get up on his feet and everything, you can get away with more, but you start getting in tight, and those wind currents, all they need to do is shift for just a few seconds, and that can really screw you. So, even like on that big buck I was talking about a couple of years ago, and how he'd reposition so quick if that wind switched, and it wasn't like he was doing a full relocation. Like, I'm going to bed over here 200 yards. It was 30, 40, 50 yards. And just that little shift basically allowed him to accommodate that new wind direction switch. It was really fun to sit back and watch just a smart deer like that, an older deer that really just played his cards just right. Every time that wind switched, it's like, okay, now I need to go over here. And now I got the currents blowing, everything's working for him there. So does that kind of answer some of that aspect? And then I think we want to talk about the approach on the deer and how okay, is that right?
Yep. But I quick want to backpedal real quick.
Yep.
When you got one locked down,
yep.
Are you paying what's going to be the hardest sense to beat? their scent, their sense of smell, or their sight? Because I know we talked about this here the other night. A lot of times they're bedding in locations where they're able to use both.
Yeah. There is no yes, there is, that can go either way. That's all relative to the situation. There's no constant to that. I mean, depending on how they're bedded and how the wind's blowing and what's going on there with currents and different things like that, it might be a factor of like, okay, sense going to be the thing that probably screws us here, if anything. Or it could be sight, it can be either one of those. Occasionally it can be hearing, if it's super quiet conditions and the terrain and the vegetation and everything that you got to sneak in on is really tough to do in quiet conditions, then you got hearing in there as well. So you can't really say, anybody that would say that, oh, it's always this or always that. Well, then the terrain and the situation is pretty identical all the time. But if you're hunting a variety of different terrains and different situations, and you've had many, many stalks, you'll come to realize that it could be any one of those three, so that's a constant revolving, it's relative to the situation. I do want to bring up a point, like I got this big buck here a few weeks back, and we spotted him in the morning at about 6 a.m. and he went over this ridge where I thought he was probably going to bed somewhere on that ridge, and there wasn't much wind. And of course, remember, we're going in there with another guy that's filming it. So you got twice the movement, twice the scent, twice the noise, everything. And you're trying to get everything filmed right. So, I looked at the weather app and I was like, okay, we're getting stronger winds here, maybe 15, 20 mile an hour or whatever later, early afternoon. So we ended up going in on that deer at around 2 p.m. Hadn't seen him for 8 hours, didn't know exactly where he was. And we went in there. We played our cards right. I got up there, and where I kind of thought maybe he had went, once I got up there, I realized, ooh, there's this other little ditch system right here with these winds coming in how they are. There's a really good chance he's in there, and we need to now work this side of the ridge real carefully, just in case in that 8 hours he repositioned to this side of the hill. Just because he went over there 8 hours doesn't mean that he didn't reposition a few hundred yards this way or whatever. So we worked all that real careful, peekabooing it. And this was a fairly tough scenario where you're skylined peekabooing a lot of this. It's not ideal, but I've actually come to find that you have a really good advantage in a lot of situations if you can do that, for a number of reasons we won't go into right now. But I didn't spot that deer until I was 7 yards from him. And then I was being real careful, and it's really easy to get sloppy. Like I had 90% of what I could see covered, but there was just a couple little pockets, and I started to get up to where I couldn't really, one pocket was over here to my right, one was to the left that I just couldn't quite cover yet to know that he's not in there. And it starts to get risky. You're if I peek my head out too far this way, if he's right over here, he can get me. So all of a sudden I realized, okay, if I backtrack here, go up to this one, I'll be able to cover this one a lot better. And then I can work this one, which is what I did. Then when I peeked up over, there was just a tiny little cubby where he could have been in this pocket to the right. And that's where he ended up being. And I was 7 yards from him. And as soon as I spotted him, I quickly backtracked up. It was fairly steep terrain right there. I quickly backed up maybe 3 yards to Ethan that was filming. And I said, we got to hang out right here. The wind was heavy when I picked him up, and then started to dip down by the time I got up to Ethan, like it was in and out. And what would happen in a situation like that, and this comes with some experience too, is I knew that I needed to hang out up there at the higher elevation to keep our scent going over the hill. Like as that wind died down, our scent likely would spin and toss right into him. That's only 10 yards below me. It'd go up and then spin into him. And we had to wait 3, 4, 5 minutes for that wind to pick back up. And then I told Ethan, we got to do this quick while this wind is strong, carrying our scent right over the hill. Because as soon as it starts to dive again, our scent's going to spin into. And it ended up working out really well, but that's just an example right there of like, the more you do that and you're out there and get in these situations, you know, you begin to just like that, see what's going to happen with your scent and do those, you know, even 5 years ago, I probably wouldn't have made the right decision on that, you know? So, but we can move on from that. Do you have anything else you want to ask on that? And I think then you want to talk about, you know, coming in on a deer with the wind. Is that right?
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I think we touched on that enough. Let's talk about approach.
Okay.
Do you want to
right.
just roll on that?
Yeah, I'll roll on that. So let's say I've got a big buck spotted and I've done all this. I've already looked, okay, the wind's going to do this. Maybe it's going to switch throughout the day here in a few hours. This is how I'm going to, maybe I'll wait those few hours and then come in like this, whatever scenario. But basically I know how the wind's going to be when I come in, at least the prevailing. I got an idea of how the currents are going to work or are working right now in there. Many times I end up coming in on like a crosswind, where I call it cheating the wind, cutting the wind. And essentially what that is I'm keeping that scent stream just off of him. You know, the more the better. But many times I've found, you know, ideally I'd love to come in downwind on a deer, but many times he's got that covered with his eyes or the doe he's with, or maybe there's a couple of satellite bucks or younger bucks around that have that all covered, and they're going to bust me sight wise. So I'm not able to do that. Many times I can't come in straight downwind. So that's why many times I end up coming in like crosswind, or, you know, kind of just keeping that scent off their nose kind of fashion. And like I said, the tighter you get, the closer you get to that animal, the finickier it gets, to where you get one little gust on the back of your neck that blows like this. And even though your wind's coming like this and this deer's right here and that scent stream is, you know, not getting to him, you get one little gust for even a couple of seconds there, and that pushes your scent 4 or 5 yards this way. And now that when that wind kicks in, it pushes it right to him. So the tighter you get on a deer, the more risky that begins to get. Does that kind of sum up some of that?
Yeah, I want to include this into that. So the reason that Jared's talking about using a crosswind is because a lot of times when a buck's bedded up, they're going to have two things in their favor: sense of smell, and then potentially sight or hearing or something else like that. So it's really, really tough to come in directly downwind, because 9 times out of 10 they can see you. Correct, Jared?
Right. There's just no way in many situations I've found to be able to do it from straight downwind. And like I said, sometimes it's not him. Sometimes it's his doe or satellite bucks, or if it's earlier season, he's bachelor grouped up with other bucks. Somebody's usually got that covered, if not a couple of animals covered, to where you just can't do it. And so you're always, seems like there's so many times you're just kind of threading the needle on like, okay, this wind can just barely work for me, and it's going to get risky and riskier the tighter I get, but this is the only option I have. And so that's why many times, you know, I'm moving in that type of way with a crosswind, or I call it cheating the wind, cutting the wind, anything like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. So I think that's we're at a good stopping point. We're at 8:30. Jared, thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah.
Where can the audience find your digital download, your DVDs, more information on Whitetail Adrenaline?
Sure. Yeah, we got our website, whitetailadrenaline.com. We've got all of our DVDs on there from all the years. We're working on our new stuff right now. It was a great season last year, a lot of content there. And just the reason we've been DVDs and people haven't found it on TV or YouTube is because we do fund this entire thing entirely off of people purchasing it which makes it no commercials, no ads, no solicitation. It just is exactly how it unfolds and happens, all the mistakes and things. And then we recently launched last year's release. Right now is available in 4K on iTunes, and that title is called Resurgence. It's a 3-part series. It's under the movies section on iTunes, so they can watch it there. If they got a smart TV, they can pull it up on their smart TV and purchase it there. So
Yeah, no. I want to thank you, Jared, personally, and everybody that's on. Go out and support Jared and what his guys are doing. Buy either a DVD or a digital download. I know I'm getting one myself. It's all excellent, great content. And even though it is styled towards entertainment, there's a lot of pieces that you can pull from that and apply to your own situation with their hunting style and tactics. And you can be really successful doing it. I started doing it about 3 years now, and I've had some of the most exciting, some of the best encounters in my hunting career. So
yeah, that's great. That's great to hear. And all of them are mistakes are in there too, so you can learn through them a little bit too, what went wrong. So we don't always break it down the best because it is unscripted, so it's whatever that character feels at the time to say. But we show all that, the good, the bad, the ugly, whatever. 0 to 0, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, everybody. If you have any questions potentially that you maybe want to try to get a hold of Jared and bounce him off, you can try to get a hold of him through his social media. The guys, his whole team is super, super active. So they're constantly out filming. They might get you, they might not. But again, Jared, I really, really appreciate you hopping on and doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. It was fun. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.